So we're heading into our third panel for today about fostering resilience for climate change adaptation through girls' education. Our Echidna Global Scholar who will be leading us off on this particular panel is Ellen Chingwanda. She is the project manager for the DFID Girls Education Challenge Fund project and the country office gender focal point with CARE International Zimbabwe. After her presentation, we will get into a moderated panel discussion led by Roger Mark D'Souza, who is the Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience at the Wilson Center, Sajida Amin, the Senior Research Associate of the Population Council, Allison Anderson, Non-Resident Fellow with the Center for Universal Education, and Marsha Adele, Senior Director for Gender Equality at Plan International, USA. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ellen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much. You guys stayed behind. I've seen some people have left, but you get the good part. Thank you for joining us for this panel. Climate change has led to increased intensity and frequency in extreme weather events, such as heat waves, floods, and droughts. For instance, although droughts are not a new phenomenon in Southern Africa, climate change has made them so severe that countries such as Zimbabwe, Malawi, Swaziland, and Lesotho have declared states of disaster. Now, communities in these countries, especially women and girls, are especially vulnerable to climate change because they are dependent on rain-fed agriculture as well as livelihoods which require water. Now, my paper explores the relationship between girls' education and climate change. And the motivation for my research comes from my experiences of leading CARE's components of a large girls' education initiative which is being implemented in drought-affected communities in Zimbabwe, as indicated on the map. What were some of the interesting findings? Going into this research, the key questions that I had were, one, how does drought affect girls' education in rural contexts? Secondly, how do girls' education programs respond in such crisis? In order to answer these questions, I assessed national as well as program-level household data on the effects of drought. I interviewed focus groups and individuals as part of my routine monitoring and project supervision visits in these areas. I also reviewed literature on girls' education, climate change and resilience, and studies on droughts in Botswana, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. What were my findings? Firstly, I found that drought multiplies the development challenges faced by communities, and this includes food insecurity, water scarcity, loss of livelihoods, lack of alternative energy, and environmental degradation. Secondly, I found that although girls' education programs have made great strides, they are not designed to respond to drought. Because one, they have no budget allocation to redirect for such activities. And two, there's little motivation, knowledge, and technical capacity to link drought to girls' education. Ultimately, drought is making it more difficult to deliver quality education because it causes damage to education systems. It threatens the well-being of communities, and it interrupts educational continuity for children. Whilst drought affects all children, my analysis found that girls are more vulnerable for the following reasons. One, they must invest more time, more energy, and more labor to find food, water, and alternative sources of energy. They have to make more effort to handle menstruation in terms of washing clothing as well as their own bodies. Girls are at an increased risk of abuse such as harassment, rape, and risky sexual behavior when they have to walk long distances to collect water. They are also at increased risk of child marriage because the family earns an income from the dowry, they have one less mouth to feed, and they feel that she will be more secure in her marriage. Droughts also affect rural livelihoods and force households to use their income for food and less on school costs. And finally, I found that households are adopting negative coping mechanisms which negatively affect girls' education, such as withdrawing children to support casual labor, migrating to other areas to find food or other income, as well as selling household and productive assets in order to find food. And the net result of that is attendance suffers. Because of lost time, some cannot catch up and have to drop out. Some are hungry to the point of fainting in the classroom. And more importantly, learning will not take place or will be negatively affected. Now, despite all these challenges, girls' education has the potential to build resilience, and thus I'm making the following recommendations. At program level, donors, governments, and development actors need to redesign funding models, education sector plans, as well as girls' education programs in order to proactively address the challenges posed by climate change. And this is not just by responding after the crisis occurs, but including these considerations at design stage. My paper also highlights that water is a critical factor for attendance, and therefore schools should be supported to meet girls' and boys' practical needs for water by building water infrastructure or rehabilitating those systems that have broken down. This is not to say that this has not been happening, but it has been more reactive than proactive. At household level, households can have income-generating activities such as producing poultry and market gardening, which are linked to a reliable and sustainable water source at the school, which will then help them to withstand the effects of drought. Households can also benefit from a water system at the school and ensure that they have enough water to use for domestic use. And then at the level of the girls themselves, it's important for us to develop new skills for resilience and for global citizenship, such as creativity, entrepreneurship, and final intelligence. And these skills will help them to expand their livelihood options, to acquire new skills, and to widen their social network, which they can draw upon during crisis. It's also critical to ensure that girls can exercise these skills by taking part in community-level adaptation efforts, as well as in demonstration or pilot projects. My paper contends that girls' education programs can and should be designed and funded to take the climate factor into account. In 2012, the National Economic Foundation conducted a research which found that the costs of doing nothing about climate change are higher than the costs of intervening. Therefore, a business-as-usual approach to girls' education without taking into account the role of climate change will be costly in the long run. For the donors, they will get low return on investment because girls are not learning and may even have to drop out. For programs, very often donors base their funding on results. If girls are not learning, NGOs risk financial loss and their reputation may also suffer, which affects future funding. At household level, families lose income and cannot continue to support girls' education. For government, they will not achieve girls' education goals such as SDG 4. And more importantly for girls, they will miss the chance to learn and therefore cannot break the cycle of poverty. Sorry, I'm not sure what has happened there. And therefore, yes, thank you. What are the next steps? Education is a key part of building climate resilience, and acknowledging climate change as a risk in girls' education will make education systems more resilient. Therefore, donors should support pilots and support some of the recommendations that are put forward in this paper by investing in initiatives focusing on girls which take the climate factor into account. Many of the girls' education programs focus on the long-standing barriers such as direct cost of schooling, distance, household chores. But I'm putting it forward that we should also be taking into account the challenges that are associated with climate and invest in understanding how those challenges can be addressed. NGOs should work with climate change actors in designing integrated girls' education programs. And finally, governments can do more to link education sector plans to drought and climate change more broadly. And I argue that it is not enough to include climate change in the curriculum, but rather to also ensure that girls can apply these skills in the ways in which they live for the collective benefit of the girls themselves, their families, as well as the communities they're coming from. Thank you very much. I now invite the panel to join me on stage.
Is it on already? Well, while we get mic'd, get ready to start the panel. My name is Roger Mark D'Souza. It's wonderful to be here. We at the Woodrow Wilson Center also host similar events. And one of the operating principles for me when we host an event at the Wilson Center is that I will generally not accept a panel that does not have adequate representation, gender representation on the panel. So glad to be the man on the panel here this afternoon. And I want to start by congratulating Ellen. Ellen said we're ready for the good stuff, and she delivered the goods. So Ellen, congratulations. I thought that was an excellent presentation and a wonderful paper. I think the topic that you have presented is very important for a number of reasons. Number one, it's very salient now. There's a lot of discussions around resilience and what it means for a variety of sectors. We're seeing this reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals and a number of discussions globally, nationally, regionally, and at a subnational level. So I congratulate you for doing this research on a very timely topic. And when I look at your paper and your presentation, I hear you talk about the importance of looking at trends, what it means in terms of the adverse impacts that you talk about. You specifically focus on the importance of developing skills. You talked about the importance of developing a social network, which young girls are able to get involved in, the importance of participation, demonstrating results, and the potential costs of inaction. So an excellent presentation, and I hope on the panel we'll be able to delve in some of those themes. But Ellen, I wanted to start by asking you one question, because as I read the paper, there was something that you did in the paper that you didn't quite do in the presentation, and it's a very contentious issue for those of us who work on resilience. So there's a lot of discussion about resilience being a buzzword, a fuzzword. What does it mean? What do you mean by resilience? And in the paper, you talk about this concept of climate resilience, but you also say the importance of developing a resilient educational sector. So talk about what you mean by resilience in this paper, in your work, and how does climate resilience differ from how you consider resilience in the educational sector?
Thank you. Now, just to start off, I think with a basic definition for resilience. Resilience basically refers to the ability to withstand shocks and also the ability to bounce back from the effects of that shock. And so in the context of climate change, climate resilience, and like I said, I gave some examples of the effects of climate change, heat waves, floods, and in the case of Zimbabwe, we're experiencing a drought. And so the challenge for us is not in the drought itself, but in the capacity to cope with the drought. And so when you look at an education system, if the drought is affecting girls' ability to attend school, girls' ability to stay in school, girls' ability to achieve positive learning outcomes, for me, that challenges the very core of that education, of that system, and in this case, it's an education system. And when I think about a system, I think about all of its components. I think about the curriculum, I think about the school infrastructure, I think about the classroom, I think about the children themselves. Are they in themselves resilient? That whole, should I say, all the different parts that make up an education system, even at the level of government, the funding models, the way in which we deliver education within a country. So climate resilience in the context of education is looking at a situation where we are matching learning to the context. And this came up in the Global Education Monitoring Report, which we launched just last week. And it was talking about the need not necessarily to just look at the contemporary ways in which we've been delivering education, but to look at the context and design a system that can withstand the shocks of that context and ensure that even within a context, I think the Education Can Wait Fund was actually talking about children should learn, especially in crisis, because during a crisis, it provides, education can provide psychosocial support. It provides a safe space for children to, find themselves and get some level of support. And so resilience for me is encompassing all those issues, being able to, in the face of a crisis, bounce back and still deliver what it's supposed to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. And so, Jada, I wanted to come to you. So Ellen talks specifically about matching learning to the context. And I know through your work in Bangladesh and through your Balika program, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and how you're looking at different types of shocks, different types of potentially climate change shocks, and how does that relate to vulnerability in education? Tell us a little bit more about the program and how you're looking at this location-specific, context-specific shocks.
Okay, so thank you. So the first thing I want to say is Balika is a program to give life skills, but it's the stated objective of Balika is to generate learning and evidence. So we did an RCT around providing life skills interventions in communities that we chose as high child marriage communities. The main objective of Balika is to delay child marriage. That all happened to be right on the coastal belt of Bangladesh that is extremely vulnerable to all kinds of climate-related vulnerabilities. If you look at large-scale satellite climate maps, they're all in the low elevation coastal zone that are vulnerable to coastal flooding, to salinity, to displacement because of various sudden onset climate events. So the first thing we did is we developed an instrument, as researchers like to do, to measure at a very local level what the specific vulnerabilities were in the areas that were working. We were actually providing intervention in 96 communities, and we found that actually the very local level variability and vulnerabilities were very different. So we measured qualitatively through local perceptions what those vulnerabilities were, and we characterized the communities. Then we explored what the associations were with prevalence of child marriage even before we started any intervention. And what we found, in general, sort of the top line messages, as Ellen has highlighted, there is a higher risk of child marriage for communities that are affected. And then we broke it down to a more nuanced measure of which type of climate vulnerability. And there actually I think, is where our most policy relevant findings were with respect to climate change. So we had communities that had experienced in the recent past 2 major cyclones, Sidr and Alia. And then we had communities that had very high proportions of displaced populations because of various climate and non-climate events. We had high salinity communities. There's a lot of shrimp cultivation, which deliberately promotes salinity with human action. And we have coastal flooding, which also generates salinity. And we found that actually where the highest vulnerability for child marriage was in those communities that had very high rates of displaced populations. And surprisingly, these communities that had received a lot of development aid post-cyclones Ayla and Sidr had lower rates of child marriage, higher rates of school achievement. So those...
Sorry, say that again. This is important.
The areas that were hit directly by cyclones and therefore had received a lot of development attention post-cyclone had lower rates of child marriage. Communities that had very high proportions of displaced populations had very high rates of child marriage. So the specific climate-related intervention that we say is agreeing that education and deprivation from education is a very important aspect that we have to do in terms of addressing resilience. We think it's important to focus attention, development aid, etc., on the question of displacement due to climate events, especially the sudden onset climate events.
Very interesting. So Marsha, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because Plan International has produced the State of the World's Girls in 2013 that focused specifically on girls and disasters. Were you seeing any of these kinds of relationships coming out of that work also?
Well, actually, what Ellen has outlined in her presentation lays the foundation for what I think is a very interesting development out of Plan's work that we could learn from. And actually, it's interesting, Plan has not done just lots and lots of work in this arena, but there is a program that we have implemented in 14 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And it is really taking education and expecting that 2 things will come out of it, or finding that 2 things will come out of it. One, we find that in the formal school system, when groups of young people and girls are actually learning about climate change, they will in fact begin to have ideas around what to do about that. The second piece is the way this is structured. These young people in the school and the girls actually go into the community to actually talk about climate change, sensitize their family members, particularly their parents and other members of the community, to let them know about how this seems to be impacting the entire community, that this is not ever probably going to change in the foreseeable future, and really to ask the question, what can we be doing about this in order to begin to prepare ourselves for either the gradual destruction of the environment or local disasters that may come on a very short onset. The name of this program is Child-Centered Climate Change Adaptation. And we use the word child because for Plan that really includes girls and boys too, up through the age of 17. And so this project really focused specifically on working with a cohort in some cohorts in upper primary school, but lower secondary school, which really had 3 pieces to it. One was an awareness piece, one was an action piece, and one is an advocacy piece. And then in the awareness piece, that is the whole learning about climate change, thinking about the impact of that, and then going into the community to talk about it and to sensitize and to ask community members to brainstorm what they think the community might do to actually address this issue. The second piece, which is around action, is to actually then the young people, particularly girls taking a lead role, will design a project which will receive a small grant, which will actually pull together ideas from either one or many of the brainstorming ideas that have come out of the community, and then implement with the support of the community and really by the community that particular piece of work. The third piece is such an interesting piece because it gets into the advocacy. And advocacy in 4CA is what this project is. We don't want to say child-centered community, child-centered climate change as the whole phrase. It's so interesting because the advocacy piece is really focused on young people advocating to local government, local leaders, local decision makers, and national and regional decision makers around issues related to climate change. And this has actually happened. What we have found is that in PNG, a group of girls spearheaded a movement to create a video around the erosion that was happening with sea coming in on community land and taking the land away. That video, when shown to an MP with the young people's group supporting the explanation of that, actually galvanized the MP to set up a fund to actually begin to build a seawall. And we even have found that for several of the ministerial meetings around disaster recovery and resilience, we have found that girls supported by boys have pitched up to claim that they do in fact have a right to be full participants in all of these discussions around what is going to happen around climate change in their country. It's really a remarkable development. Now, to summarize, because I really want us to understand this, what we mean is that awareness in this project gives the girls the knowledge. The action in the project gives them a chance to become leaders. And the advocacy in the project gives them a chance to develop and use their voice and often experience the success and, I will say, empowerment that comes with that kind of successful advocacy. So that brings us to the bottom line, and that is what we really have is a project here which was not intended as a project that would actually bring life skills to life, but in fact does exactly that. I mean, this is so exciting, what's happening. And we've done this in 14 countries, and if we can do it in 14 countries, we can all do it in a whole lot more. I think there's a lot more analysis we need to do of the findings because this was not the intention of the original project to be a gender, particularly hugely gender aware and gender promotional piece around gender equality and rights-based advocacy, but that is what we have. So I love the foundation you've raised, and that's given me a chance to share this very exciting piece of work around life skills, really, life skills in action.
Thank you, Marsha. It's really good to hear about this 4CA approach. I think it's quite exciting. Earlier today, you had a fireside chat with Joyce Bonder, who is currently a distinguished fellow with us at the Wilson Center. And I've been talking with President Bonder about these issues. And one of the things that we have been debating, two things actually. She has been saying that leaders are born, not created. President, respectfully, I don't know that I agree. Good point of contention. And Joyce is very much focused on girls' education. And the second point that we have been debating is the lack of willingness to create leadership spaces for young people globally, but particularly on the continent. So it's really good to see this happening at a local community level with direct engagement. So congratulations. Wonderful. Alison, I wanted to come to you because I know in your work you have made this connection previously between climate change and education. And I wonder, from your perspective, being here at Brookings, how do we sustain interest in these connections? You know, how do we determine at a think tank or in the NGO communities or the local government level that this is a priority? How do we keep these type of important connections that Ellen is revealing on the radar screen. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think there are two things we really need. We need more stories exactly like what you both are talking about, but these personal stories that show the impact in individual lives, in societies and communities. And then we also need hard evidence. And I think that's been missing. When we look at, back in 2010, actually, I wrote a policy paper for Brookings really recommending that the climate change agenda be expanded to include education as a tool, not only for adaptation, but also for mitigation, for climate change mitigation. And over the past several years, I've been kind of disheartened to see that that hasn't moved forward so much, particularly discussions on mitigation at the very high level, policy level, and the money that follows from that is really about these large-scale mitigation projects in terms of clean energy, zero or low-carbon growth. And so in education, and the role that education can play, because there is a role for education in terms of clean schools, in terms of energy efficiency, zero waste, environmental sustainability. All of these roles that education can play in mitigation hasn't been at the table. And even in adaptation, education is at the table, particularly because of these kinds of programs that are being moved forward by communities, by individuals on the ground who recognize the impact that climate change is having on their lives, on their school, on their individual education. And they've moved that forward. But even, I think, at adaptation policy discussion levels, it hasn't really moved forward. And I think to keep it on the agenda, we not only need these stories, but we need, as I was getting to, evidence. I think that the climate change education leader, which is mandated to be UNESCO, can do a much better job in helping to really concretely define what we're talking about so that we can better monitor and evaluate climate change education or adaptation or mitigation programs so that we can all work together as a community, which I don't think is happening. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that case.
I think you raise a number of really good points. So the stories, the evidence, mitigation, adaptation. I think, as you know, I've been working on the connections between these issues for a long time at groups like Population Reference Bureau, the Sierra Club, Population Action International, and working at this from the climate change side of it. And some of what we had done in this body of work over the last 15 years is to figure out how do we bring the climate change community to think about and reflect on these issues. And we were thinking, do we address this from a reproductive health perspective, from a maternal health perspective? And what we discovered was that engaging climate change specialists and experts, that the messaging that resonated the most was on women's empowerment and tying that to education and investing in girls' education. This is why I'm so glad that you've done this research, that we're having this dialogue today. I know we don't have many climate change specialists in the room per se. There may be some of us here, but this is one way to bring in that community, and the polling and research has demonstrated that. So I think that's really compelling. Ellen, I wanted to come back to you a little bit. In thinking about the session today, I have worked with a couple researchers and journalists who are thinking about how do you tell these compelling stories and have evidence. And they have done a lot of work in India and in Bangladesh to look at these connections. And they have looked at them in areas that are being severely impacted by climate change impacts, but they also looked at it in areas where there is a lot of conflict and instability and displacement in these communities. And in the work that Priyali Sur has done, who's a journalist from India that we have worked with, and another colleague, Sam Eaton, who's another journalist who's investigated this, they have also found that climate change, in addition to leading to displacement and livelihood instability in conflict-affected areas, has produced more trafficking. and particularly trafficking of girls. And they have spoken to traffickers who are actually looking at when these shocks occur. And these traffickers are saying, listen, now is a good time for me to go in because I know I can capture more girls because the families are more vulnerable because of their livelihood that has been disrupted because of displacement. So there's another element here. So there are programs that have captured these girls and brought them back, put them into formal education settings, and the girls are helping to monitor when a climate shock occurs, when strangers are coming into the community, when girls suddenly have new clothes, what's happening there? When a girl is missing from class for a few hours, they reach out to the families. But this is a really complicated picture. We're talking climate shocks, displacement, conflict, livelihood instability, trafficking. Whoa! This is really complex. There's a lot going on. So in your research, and I want to talk a little bit about what's next for you. How do you determine what's the point of intervention for you in this complexity that's out there?
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you've brought up the issue of conflict and instability. Actually, in my paper, you will notice that I also read an article that came from the White House that was talking about how climate change can actually cause instability in a country, not only in the United States, but other regions, because climate change leads to, like you said, displacement. It leads to conflict around resources, water, land. It also leads to a rise in food prices. And so all of those negative effects tend to, amount to instability. And I also noted in the paper that climate change leads to an increase in vulnerability to, abuse and also exploitation. And in my paper, I actually talk about the fact that there's an increase in incidences of, intergenerational relationships, as well as, rape and harassment that is linked to girls selling their bodies in exchange for food and for cash. And so I feel like climate change, and even myself going into this research, I don't think I was prepared for some of the things that I found out, not only in reading the literature, but in talking to the program participants who are part of the girls' education work that I'm doing in Zimbabwe. But in terms of a point of entry, the communities were very clear that I think the starting point is from a survival point of view. Climate change affects, food availability. It affects, water. It affects their livelihoods. And so when I think about how we operate as NGOs, I think, when you think about Plan or CARE or World Vision or whichever organization, we are very siloed in the way we approach our work. So we have a food security division. We have a nutrition division, you have maternal health, you have education, you have WASH. But when you look at climate change, and I'll take this from the point of view of the 17 SDGs that we have now. In order for us to achieve SDG 4, we will need to achieve many of the other SDGs. When you look at SDG 5 on gender equality, when you look at the SDG on water, the SDG on food, the SDG on infrastructure, the SDG on climate change. So let's look at the girl as a whole person. And her education is connected to that wholeness. It's connected to all the other needs that she has within her family, within her community. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would want to see a community or a school that has all these different projects happening at the same time. So that I'm not going in there as an education specialist or a gender specialist and saying, well, I've come to improve your education. Because then one of the biggest barriers to girls' education is household chores. But when you unpack household chores, what are we talking about? We're talking about water. We're talking about food. You're talking about looking after the ill. You're talking about, fetching firewood or finding firewood. But if you're in a drought, and it is not raining, where is this firewood? If you're talking about a drought and it's not raining, where's this water? Where's this food? And so for me, I believe that we may want to talk about integrated approach to development, which looks at the whole communities, the girl in totality. How do we ensure that in order to get those education outcomes that we want, we are addressing all of the issues that affect her? But I also liked what you said, Marsha, and I think we were chatting a little bit earlier about it's not in, it has to, and I like what Ganga and my previous fellow scholars, Joyce and Christine, were talking about the skills. It's also about how do we get them to exercise those skills. And so if we could get pilots such as the one that you talk about, where girls have an opportunity to exercise these skills for resilience. When you look at water governance, for instance, I was thinking about in my mind, if we had a school, because the school is such a hub of community activities, if we had a school that has a water solution that is reliable, powered by alternative energy sources, because Africa is not a resource that is in short supply in our countries. How do we take advantage of that? A reliable water supply that is powered by solar energy, governed by girls. Because girls understand that if we break this water system down, it means we're going to walk 5 kilometers. What is the value of taking care of this infrastructure? How do we ensure that there's equitable distribution? So it's those kinds of ideas that we should think about and see how that can also benefit the school and the community as well. So it's trying out different things. And I think earlier on it was Ganga who talked about risk, the risk of thinking about different ways in which we can learn, match the learning to the context that we are coming from.
So, Heather, I think Ellen raises a really good point about dealing with risk and integration. You know, we talk about being able to wave this magic wand, and yes, if only we could really have these integrated programs. It's not that easy. There are funding barriers, there are reporting barriers, there are administrative barriers, there are skills and expertise barriers, there are territorial issues, there are perception issues, there are reputational issues, there are fears of mission drift. You know, the list goes on and on. Yet the SDGs talk all about integration. I wonder for you and your work, you know, you came out with strong conclusions around climate change. Was that surprising for you in your work? And how, you know, you being at an organization that is looking at population issues and demography, how do you then get to this point of integration, of looking to climate change? How are you dealing with that, managing that?
Big question. Well, first of all, we have to get climate change on the agenda and make the connections about what about climate change.
And I'm sorry, on the agenda for whom? On whose agenda?
For
Is this
a global development agenda, but also internally to actually pinpoint what about population processes and demography can we most usefully deploy in this conversation. So on the one hand, our mandate is to address the most vulnerable. And specifically in the area I work in, the most vulnerable girls in the most vulnerable communities. So what are those points of vulnerability? Or what are the sources of redress? So I think that's where I see a connect with what Ellen is saying. In the work we did, so in Balika, we demonstrated with very rigorous evidence that what we did with Balika worked to address a whole range of issues, including child marriage, education, sexual and reproductive health, etc. So what was about it? I think at the crux of the intervention were three things. One is we focused on the most vulnerable girls, but we didn't ignore the community. So we had skills development for girls with a lot of community engagement and ownership in the community. And I think the reason that's important is because of the social capital that generates that's valuable for everyone, but most valuable for the most vulnerable girls. We also wanted to include in the skills element life skills and livelihood skills that were generic, not specific to any particular outcome that we were looking at. And for me, the generic nature of the skills that made the most difference was that we offered access to technology and to information through that technology. So the way we created a community-based platform is by offering computers to the community that they owned, that gave livelihood skills to the girls. So I think what was useful about it is, first of all, a very clear identification of what the girls were getting out of it, rather than being talked at with vague probabilities of whether it's impending vulnerabilities or impending chances of child marriage. Specifically, you're learning how to use the computer to access information about weather patterns that can be important for disaster. I'm just making this up, but very, very specific kind of technologies. For me, the transformative aspect of that technology, the gender transformative aspect, was that these are girls who are the first ones in their community to actually sit down at a computer and make it work. A lot of these communities, because of the considerable investment that the government has made, they have computers that are locked up because if you touch it, it might break. So one of our major achievements was to say the computer doesn't break if you touch it, and you can actually get something out of it. It doesn't have to reside in a locked up room and be preserved for longevity. So it's small wins, but I think they accumulate to very transformative change in the community. And I think the important thing is sort of keeping a focus on girls' skills. We didn't so much emphasize girls' ownership of assets because we actually took a much more timid role in terms of engaging the community and upending the power structures of the community by basically saying this is extra for the community that helps to helps girls navigate their vulnerabilities.
And I think it's really important. I think part of what you're also raising is the importance of getting away from the messaging and the narrative of vulnerability to agents of change. These are how these girls can actually make a difference themselves. So they're not just vulnerable and being acted upon. They're very concrete, specific, logical things that they can be doing. So Marsha, I was glad that you talked about the 4CA program. One of the things that immediately popped up for me, and I think this is a little bit of what you were saying, you talk about it in terms of the benefit to girls. I wondered to what degree in your work you were able to deal with social and cultural norms with regard to the girls. I know you're looking at both girls and boys, but you're saying awareness, action, advocacy, the girls are getting this information, they're able to go out into the communities and be champions. But there must have been some barriers. Talk a little bit about the challenges and what you learned in sort of managing those dynamics.
Yeah, well, there are always barriers. We all know that.
Yeah.
And I would say that underpinning all of this, and I think probably you have found the same in the project that you've been working with, is really an approach to empowerment and gender, which is very asset-based. That is, it's not about empowering girls or anything like that. It's about girls understanding how powerful they already are, which is a very different approach. And when you take that approach and actually begin to frame that as the way that you're going to do a project, you really begin to open up in the whole way you communicate with girls and boys as well in the classroom, the idea that it's yours to do.
Yes.
Now, what we have found, and why I would actually disagree with Dr. Banda about this business about leaders being born.
I disagree
and I
too.
almost said something this morning, but I restrained.
Did she say that this morning?
She did.
Oh, she did.
She did.
You didn't
And
take her to task?
Yeah, I should have.
Oh,
but it
you
was
should
early
have.
in the morning. I didn't want to put us off on a negative leg. But if she would like evidence, have her come and we'll go out and I'll show her evidence. Girls who, exactly what we heard earlier.
Yeah.
Girls in this particular program for CA who started out, and this was not just focused on girls, so they started out in their classrooms often being shy, retiring, the boys would be taking charge.
Yeah.
But as they began, again with this asset-based approach that was being handled by the facilitators, that girls can do it. And by actually putting often girls together in small groups, because one of the things that we had confirmed in this project, but we found it in many, many places, is that girls do well when they're not alone. They do well when they have a buddy. They do well when they're in a small group. They do hugely well if they're in, for example, young women in a savings group, which is single sex. So in any case, however that is, it began to happen. And this is what I would like Dr. Banda to actually see, because in fact, those girls began to feel that in fact they did have a lot to offer, and in fact they began to really want to push the boys aside and take over. And they did in many cases feel that they had a better idea than the guys did, and often they were right. Not always. There were a few times when they weren't, but often they were right.
Yep.
So I think it's a whole question partly about the whole way one approaches this whole development around gender and around girls, and doing it in a way that you don't alienate, obviously, if we're going to talk about a two-pronged system of boys and girls, that you don't in any way. Again, it's an asset-based approach,
Sure.
So that you aren't at all really marginalizing it directly, but you're making it possible for girls to actually take charge. And so we saw it, and anyone who would like to go out and take a look at it, I'd love to get out there myself to take a look at it now. So
I will be conveying your message to Dr.
please,
Banda.
all right, and I would be happy to meet with her as well.
Excellent.
But I think we've all had that experience.
Sure.
This isn't anything that's new.
Excellent, thank you. So Alison, I wanted to get back to you a little bit on this question of skills. We started talking about skills. We talked about asset-based skill building, skill development being transformative. Have you been looking at skill development in this space, and what are you seeing? And then we'll come to you for your questions and reactions.
Yes, and I'm sure many of you out there can add on to this, but certainly in my research at Brookings, I've looked across many programs around the world on climate change education and resilience, and looked at, well, what are some common components? And certainly some of those skills are ones that we've been talking about all day, the sort of learning and global citizenship skills, including critical thinking, which includes issue analysis, decision-making skills, problem solving, collaborative working, and communication skills. And those are very important. I've also seen, as Maria and all the speakers actually have talked a little bit about, skills that are quite important around environmental stewardship. So that includes environmental education, climate change, the basic scientific literacy behind it, this idea of some risk perception, understanding risk perception, and some as you get older, some deeper systems thinking. And certainly the disaster risk reduction and preparedness element, making sure that young people, or all learners, know and have the knowledge to prepare for and recover from hazards that they might face. And just to reiterate what's already been said, that across those kind of three sets of skills, so the learning skills, the environmental stewardship and climate literacy, and the risk reduction and preparedness, it's absolutely crucial that these are not just learned in a classroom rote learning, that they're applied. I've seen some great examples of schools themselves being used as innovation labs, as you talked about. How can students work in a group to apply this kind of knowledge to reduce energy waste, just as one example, or to catch rainwater to ensure that there is a supply of rain for the school during droughts even. And that students are agents of change. They're seen as, it's really about active learning, and that young people are agents of change, and that what they learn can be passed on to others within the community, especially through, as you mentioned, some of these creative means such as drama, music, and things like that, so others benefit from this. And I'll just say, One other thing, which is really to second, again, what Ellen has said. So those are some individual skills, but also if we can think of, in some ways, skills for the education system, as you said, we have to make sure that in addition to learning those skills, that education systems themselves are climate resilient, so that disaster risk reduction is incorporated into school management policy, that there are contingency plans should there be a disaster, that students and teachers practice for early warning, drills, for evacuation, all of these things.
Great, thank you. So we're going to come to you now, but Ellen, I'm going to give you something to think about that I'd like to come back to at the end of the panel. And when we get to the end, I'd like to give you the final word. But I know Alison has spoken about the importance of telling stories. And I would like you to be thinking about a story about this work that you think really motivates you, that we can take away from our discussion today. So I'm going to come back to that at the end. But I want you to tell someone's story, because very often folks are not going to remember everything that we've said on the panel, but they will remember the story. Mm-hmm. So think of something towards the end. Let's open it up. Yes. And we'll take a few questions at the back, please.
Hi, Jenny Gamble here with CUE. Thank you so much to all of the panelists and our moderator for such a stimulating conversation at what can be a low-energy time of the day. But this question is particularly for Ellen, but I think many of you on the panel may also have experiences or have evidence or observations around this. And it's really around the issue of integrated programming for girls' education or in girls' education, and going back to that issue of community resilience and community savings programs. So something that has not been talked a lot about, and I'm interested to know if you've seen new evidence or what you've observed in the field, what role have you seen or do you suspect that village savings accounts or financial literacy skills play in supporting and reinforcing community resilience, particularly around that aspect of girls' education and the choices maybe that families may make because of lack of resources? But what have you seen with those kinds of different integrated program aspects for girls' education?
Excellent, thank you. I think there was another hand across here. Yes, please. No, I'm sorry, we come to you. Yes, go ahead. Did you have your hand up? Yes, please.
Hi, this is Maria. I'm from Pakistan. I've mostly worked with the government to improve the teacher training as well as the curriculum. So a lot of what was discussed was a lot of interest to me. My question to the panel in general is that has there? So we have talked about, and I think Alison just spoke about this, how it's important to have this as part of the school policy. So I know there's a lot of value in having discrete movements where groups come together and have education related to climate change. But has there been any effort in your that you have come across in your research where there was an effort by any government to make this as a mainstream thing, to include it as part of the national curriculum and the teacher training, and to basically view this as not an add-on thing, which is separate from achieving the Millennium Development Goals of primary enrollment and the SDGs of education, but as something which is affecting the access to education itself. Secondly, my question to Sajida would be, I really found your research to be very interesting as to the development aid for displaced people not being the most effective. My question to you is that, so in Pakistan also we have faced a lot of, earthquakes, and oftentimes what happened was that the development aid was misused and misallocated, and there was a, lack of transparency around that. So my question to you would be that, is there any evidence as to, so there's one question about allocating the development aid to a different group of people, but then there's a whole question about should we only rely on development aid, or should we make them more in control of the situation? So some comments on that.
Yes, please, let's move quickly to you.
Okay, well, Ellen, you had talked about the importance of water primarily because you're dealing with drought in Zimbabwe. Others are dealing with other things. And so you had said that if the schools could be the source of the water, that this could solve the whole question of dispersal. People wouldn't have to move. It could help them with their income. It could help them stay in school, not leave. First of all, how expensive is it to install a water supply at the school that's safe, that not just safe, but that's continual, that's reliable, and that the resilience builds on that? So number one, how expensive is it? And number two, is the government doing that already? Because everything else that you had described earlier flows from that. The retention, the completion, the grades, the safety, everything. So it would be really nice to hear what's being done for how much.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Helen, and the panelists for that good presentation. I'm just following up what my colleagues on the floor have said about what the governments are doing. Governments are doing a lot of things around the world, and I'm not sure why all the panelists have not talked about the UNESCO programs around the world, that governments are making agreements on resilience, on climate change. Governments are developing strategic plans on green growth economies. They are mainstreaming the ESDs and the SDGs in the curriculum. The international community is doing a lot with communities. There are best practices in the communities where children are learning. They are working with schools. So I am feeling that is left out.
Great.
There is a vacuum. Thank you.
Thank you. We take one more. Okay, a guy put up his hand, so I'll take two more. We'll come to you, and then we get the gentleman.
Thanks. It was just to pick up on Alison's point around skills development and thinking more about the issue of educational content and the link to post-school opportunities and productive livelihoods, back to a point that Judith Ann raised this morning around the split there and the fact that education can be devalued if parents don't see there's a productive opportunity. And I think one thing that we're really seeing is that the issue of educational content around sustainable agriculture and linking that to post-school opportunities, particularly in marginalised and vulnerable communities, is a critical opportunity both to address resilience and to link to post-school and productive livelihoods for young people within those marginalised communities. And it would be interesting to hear more about where you've seen that take shape and where you see more of those opportunities could lead to.
Great question. And our last question?
So hi, my question is regarding, so most of the conversation over here is on preventative strategies. However, when I talk about climate change and displacement of people, we are also talking about reactive measures. And I think an example of this, which will illustrate it, is the migrating communities. So I've been working on projects in desert areas in which there are communities that migrate very often, and more so now with climate change effects. So in that case, the traditional idea of a school or even making a school resilient to climate change would not work because the communities are no longer there. And we're talking about small nomadic communities. So in that scenario, how do you react to such a change in demographics? And are there models in other parts of the world in which such nomadic or moving communities have maintained access to education throughout the year?
Great, excellent, thank you. So a short list of things for you to think about. I will ask each of you to respond to one, two, but not to all of the questions. So how does integrated programming link with saving programs and financial literacy? Are there any national level government policies that are bringing these approaches officially into school programs, school policies? What about aid and aid for displacement? What's the role of development development aid? How do we move beyond just development aid? A question about water and infrastructure. And this is an important question because when we talk about resilience building, there's a lot of work on resilience building from an infrastructure development. But that's not all we're talking about. So how do we make that connection? What about the positive stories? What's happening with what governments are doing? UNESCO, can we talk a little bit more about that? How do we get to thinking of skills development post-secondary school? And how does it lead to long-term productive engagement and opportunities, particularly in marginalized communities? And then if you are addressing these issues from a reactive position, what happens when the community is no longer there? You know, in the climate change arena, we talk about adaptation, we talk about mitigation, we also talk about loss and damage. And loss and damage are things that are damaged and can be repaired, but then things that are lost and are gone. People's ancestral lands, land itself, coastal areas, and then so there's a lot packed in there. So we're going to start with you. You can address one or two of the questions.
Okay. So I think I'm going to try and answer the question about development aid and reactive measures in one presumably understandable response. So in terms of development aid, I think an important thing to recognize in the climate world in particular, in a context like Pakistan or Bangladesh, is that a lot of aid is going to flow post-disaster. And that informs and structures where the money is going. So in the case of the cyclones, Ayla and Sidr, they came and quickly got channeled to areas directly hit. And I think what you're saying about how people respond is the reality of what happens post these disasters, which is people, as part of their adaptive strategies, will have to move. And I think it's really important to understand what processes that event will trigger in terms of people's own adaptive strategies. And definitely sort of tracing the movement is part of that. Now, I think so what's the education response to tracing the movement? I think the refugee community has a lot to offer in terms of how you package schooling in the context of camps, etc. I think you also have to talk about kind of flexible learning or mobile learning and aspects of technology learning, distance learning that might address some of these issues. Some of the work that we've done on migrant girls, for instance, identifies the specific moment of migration as a point of vulnerability, the arrival point of in the destination areas. So you have to actually try and convince your development community that even though Ayla has hit the southern reaches of Sundarbans, the people are actually ending up in Khulna, and that's where you need to make your investments. Yeah. And it's a hard transition to make, but I think that dynamic is important to address. So,
excellent.
Have I done that?
Very comprehensive. Thank you. Marsha?
I'll just touch briefly on the economic empowerment piece. Financial literacy, absolutely core. Savings groups, absolutely hugely valuable, not only because of the financial piece, which tends to raise the status of girls in the family, where they may for the first time actually offer an opinion that someone really does pay attention to, but also the savings group in this time of crisis can provide a solidarity group, which is no kidding in terms of its value to the members. The other piece I would add is that the solidarity savings groups or savings-led groups actually become a platform for all kinds of assistance that may be coming into an area for the delivery. And that means that really and truly that group is positioned to begin to take advantage of any of the external, any of the resources coming in from outside.
Thank you.
How expensive is it to install a water system? Is government doing that already? So you will notice in my report that one of the studies that were done by UNICEF found that 47% of the schools in Southern Africa, only 47%, have water on the premise. But in Zimbabwe, that percentage is actually a little bit higher than that. However, it doesn't account for the water systems that have broken down. And so definitely it's an important infrastructure as part of building resilience is a key part of this whole discussion. And water, as I said earlier on, appeared to be a critical factor for attendance, because then children need water not only at home but also during the time that they are within the school. And UNICEF has continued to be a big player in terms of the WASH sector in Zimbabwe and I think elsewhere, and they've been really trying to ensure that they support the drilling of boreholes in some of the schools. But needless to say, their program doesn't cover all the schools, and therefore there remains a gap in terms of ensuring that all schools have a reliable water system that can support children's needs, teachers' needs, as well as communities' needs. And so in terms of it being, expensive or cheap, I think it's something that is possible and doable. I don't have the costs of how much it would, cost for us to drill a borehole, but I know that these are costs that are manageable, particularly from a programmatic point of view. And I also think that it's important to remember that the point of departure of this discussion is from a girls' education perspective. So I use my experiences of trying to improve girls' educational outcomes and looking at what are some of those things that create barriers. And the climate factor is coming up because it masks a lot of the other barriers that we are addressing as a sector.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, I'll just note that there are some governments that are working to integrate climate change education within its national curricula. I know the Philippines has done some work on that, thanks in part to some of the work that Plan has done on child-centered adaptation and risk reduction. And a lot of sort of low-lying coastal countries like Samoa and others that are really directly impacted and feel that threat have integrated. And so there are some lessons learned. And as you pointed, the ESD community, Education for Sustainable Development community, has, along with these others, have really moved things down at the local level. We see a lot of adaptation programs. I think what we're missing is the ability to raise up the lessons learned and data and stories to really move education as a tool and move that up in policy discourse, and because that's where the funding will follow from as well. And we do need funding for this important work.
I very much appreciate that point, myself being from a small island developing state. Those of us who are from SIDS, you talk about climate change and you talk about education. This is real. This is not an abstract idea. And we're seeing this in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, that these messages are being more and more integrated into the education systems. So just before we go to our networking reception, I really want again to thank Ellen. She started us by reminding us that the challenge is not in the drought itself, but in the capacity to deal with the drought. And that there's an important, significant to think about how we match learning to the context and to understand the shocks of that context. I sort of have three key takeaways from our discussion today. I think we learned a lot about innovative programming opportunities, whether it's awareness, action, and advocacy building, whether it's asset-based transformative skills development, whether it's around community engagement and transformative livelihood options. So we talked a lot about innovative programming that is addressing these issues in a very much an integrated way. We also talked about how you communicate and talk about these issues and what that means at the community level. How do you engage the community level? But how do you take this up to local government levels, to national level, internationally? We talked about the importance of stories. We talked about the importance of data, evidence, demonstration. We talked about the importance of champions and positioning those champions to be able to make the case. So there was a very strong element of our discussion about how do you move this to policy advocacy and communication, and how that is infused by research and evidence that's both academic but from the field, knowing what works and what's been tested and how we demonstrate that and talk about impacts. And then with your contributions, it took us to thinking about what are the policy implications. What does it mean for the positive interventions that governments are already doing? What does it mean for how we think about resilience and infrastructure development? What does it mean for how we think about aid and development assistance? What does it mean for long-term solutions beyond secondary school education and creating opportunities that are important? So we covered quite a bit in a short period of time. So Ellen, thank you, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.
That was so excellent.
So in order to end this panel, before we go on to our networking reception, Ellen, I'd like you to imagine that you, once again, have come to visit me at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm on the 6th floor, and you're leaving. We've had a really good discussion once again. You're leaving, and you're going from the 6th floor to the 1st floor. And as you go into the elevator, you meet my boss, Jane Harmon, who's a congresswoman from LA. And Congresswoman Harmon asks you, so what are you doing here? What is your work about? You have that ride from the 6th floor to the 1st floor to tell her a compelling story so that she will want to find out more. What's your story?
That's tough, yes. I'll tell her to imagine herself in Zimbabwe, in a rural part of Zimbabwe, and share an experience where I visited a school. And we were, like I said, on a routine project monitoring visit. And to imagine children who have just finished class walking into an orchard at a school, looking for fruits on a tree. And these fruits are not well developed because it didn't rain. And they're raw. They are not, they've not ripened. And they're eating those fruits. Some of the children were walking into a nearby, I don't want to call it a thicket, but walked to a nearby collection of trees, or should I say, and were looking for the marula fruit. And that marula fruit has a nut inside that the children were eating. And I had to ask, all the children are rushing. It seems to be there's something drawing these children to these different places. What is drawing them? And the teacher said, they're basically looking for something to ease their hunger before they go to the next class. And the teacher also talked about, they were concerned about the fact that, for instance, the marula fruit has a high alcohol content. And so what it needs them what it means for them is that they'll also need a lot of water. But there's no water at the school. And the children will have to leave the school premises in order to access that water. That, for me, is an example of how drought has an impact on education, more so for girls, but also for boys. And we need to come together, girls' education actors, climate change actors, and see how we can, deal with this issue. I don't know whether I should be convinced, but that's the story.
Sorry, she'll then call me. Do it.